So this is our fifth
Yes.
discussion.
Mhm.
And this time we wanted to talk a little bit more about something that from the phenomenological point of view we try to avoid, but from the psychoanalytic point of view, it's, I think, quite an important part of the practice. And that's the question of interpretation. Phenomenologically, we try to stay at the level of description and not to interpret. But I'm wondering, from your tradition, how do you use interpretation, and especially how do you kind of cross that with your focusing sensitivities?
Yeah, well, maybe I could start with saying that from the point of view of focusing and Eugene Genlin,
Sure.
interpretation is one of those things that we do to try to carry forward what is there in the moment for the client. So I love the rule of thumb that Gene has in his paper, the experiential response. Do anything and then go back to listening. So if something is stuck, and I would go further and say it may not be stuck, but it may be in the therapist rather than in the client. It may be emerging in the dyad through the therapist rather than through the client, or maybe more implicitly in the client, and then saying what's there for you as the therapist is a looser way of talking about one form of the way we would think of interpretation. It's the meaning or the association that I have as a therapist, and I share that usually in a very brief way. I don't go into a whole song and dance about it, hopefully, unless I'm very tired and I go into long. Winnicott talked about that when he was rested, he would hardly say very much, and when he was tired, he would go on and on with his interpretations. Anyway, but to say in a nutshell the way I see something, and then see if it generates energy, life, forward movement for the client, and if it doesn't, Gene always goes, well, forget about that, right? So that's the place where it crosses.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it's good to start there. So because the psychoanalytic view of interpretation has a whole history of, way back when Freud thought of the unconscious as this cauldron of edible,
Yeah, that's
right.
Yeah.
And the client didn't know that, and the therapist knew it because they had read Freud and all the followers of Freud. And so the therapist would interpret what was in that cauldron, for the client. And then if the client said, well, I don't know, it's not really that I want to kill my father. And then the therapist will say, oh yes, you're resisting, or something like that. So the client couldn't win there.
Exactly. And it's a form of understanding interpretation that I think also includes the idea that the analyst is a kind of a blank screen. The analyst has undergone their own analysis to the point that they can be an accurate reflection of the client's unconscious.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that I think is very rare in psychoanalysis now, that form of interpretation. And psychoanalysts have understood more and more that the unconscious is not a place or a container of these formed things,
Mhm.
but it is the experience that's totally out of awareness. And that therapy, of course, is the what's out of awareness for the client and what's out of awareness for the therapist, and the process of becoming more aware. So interpretation in a contemporary relational psychoanalysis is simply offering a way that makes sense to you of what might be going on for the person that they are unaware of, or maybe slightly aware of, um, or are trying to get at in some way,
Mhm.
and that it's what is trying to come, and that
Mhm.
certainly crosses well with focusing.
So when you say that, it sounds like what you're calling interpretation, when you're working in this crossed way between relational psychoanalysis and focusing, what you're calling interpretation is something that can arise from your own experience during the interaction with the client.
Mm-hmm.
But it also sounds like you leave open the door to it, the interpretation also perhaps being informed by theory.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
And we should tell people, I think. And we haven't for years argued about theory, but
I won those arguments years ago.
oh, you did. Well, I think at a future point you'll have to tell me about how you did that. We had a lot of fun arguing with each other.
Yeah.
Um, but I saw more recently, as we've grown up now,
Yeah.
uh, that we never really got to, in those arguments, what we were, what the conflict was. At some point we will, um, and that will be a whole different thing of what we value, because in the way that I'm talking about theory, it can be um, therapeutic theory, psychological theory, philosophy, but any kinds of theory, any ways that we, that any schemas and insights that we've gained through the years that have struck us about how things happen, and
Mhm.
um, and that those can be very useful. And the client, of course, has all of their theories that
Yes.
they're uh, implicitly talking from, and it's important for us to know those, to ask into those
Mhm.
ways that they think that life works.
Yes, not just theory, but assumption and inherited ideas, biases, like we all have. But I want to just go back to interpretation for a moment, because when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking from an existential perspective, the intention is to stay as close to description as possible. But there's also an acknowledgement that that isn't possible, that any kind of description or reflecting back is going to have some element of interpretation in it. And I'm thinking, when I work with a client, I certainly don't want to simply reflect back the exact same words the client has just said. That could be called descriptive. And you could claim it's not interpretive because it's their exact words. But somehow it doesn't have kind of the lived experience in it.
Of course.
So anytime that I reflect back to a client, it's going to be in my own words. It's going to be in some way, my interpretation, or you could say my sense or my experience of what's alive for the client, or what's resonating for the two of us. So it's offered in a way that is intended for the client to actually check to see if it fits or not. That might be something that's quite something we emphasize more maybe than some therapeutic approaches. Um, but it's interesting to me that if it doesn't fit, at least what we would normally say is that we drop it.
Mhm.
However, in practice, do we drop it?
It's a good question.
Mhm.
And another question is, even if we've dropped it,
Mhm.
saying it is an action. It's a relational experience.
Yes.
Mostly what the client is listening for is how you experience them, how you feel about them,
Mhm.
where you're coming from. So if
Yeah.
I give an interpretation that doesn't fit for the client, it's done something already. I can't just say, forget about that because it's
Yeah.
now there.
Yeah.
And then I have to say much more than that. So I wouldn't be just like, Jean, forget that. I would say, oh, when I said that that was wrong because blah, 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 I would have to go back and say, I understand now that you were trying to say this, or, you know, that it wasn't about that, or something that brings me back into the relational space, um, where the client is feeling we're on the same page.
Mhm. Yes. And for me, some of that work is done relationally with the client,
Mhm,
and some of it is done internally.
mhm. Yes.
Yeah, because I would, if I have offered something that was too far from where their experience was in the moment,
Mhm.
like I was leaping ahead too much or something, I might still think, but there's something about that. Like I could feel in my body that there's something about that that isn't wrong.
Right. Mhm.
And I would hold it, looking for kind of then sort of almost comparing what's actually alive and happening with
Yes.
the idea I had that I thought was right.
Yes.
And usually then finding how it needed to be refined.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then I might bring it in relationally and said, when I said a few minutes ago,
Mhm.
now I can see how that wasn't quite right.
Uh-huh.
And then give them another go at it.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, 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 yes. I like that. That you're dancing with the other and seeing that move, and then you see that, and it isn't about the interpretation being wrong. It's about it being wrong in that moment.
Yeah.
uh,
So
it's not about whether something is true or not true, right? Or, and that's one of the most difficult things, I think, for us to remember, and for beginning therapists to get, that it's not about what's true and not true, what's right or what's wrong. It's about what's alive and what's dead, what is moving and generative,
exactly.
and
Exactly.
what is pulling us down. And
Exactly.
it's very hard to always remember that, but
Yeah.
but we can see it. I mean,
Yes.
this is where your phenomenology comes in. That it's not just what's said, but we can see in the moment what happens. If the person gets more thoughtful, they get
Hmm.
more connected, they get uh, more alive, or they go flat, or they change the subject, or they look at us blankly. I mean, uh,
Yeah.
that's Jean's definition of a sensitive therapist, not the one that knows how to perfectly um, be with the person, but the one who listens very carefully to the very next thing, not only verbally, but non-verbally, that
Exactly.
the person says after you say something.
Exactly. As a therapist working in this way, you're not kind of celebrating those moments where the client says, yeah, yeah, that's it, exactly. in a way that sounds kind of like, I agree with you. Can we move on now, please?
Right, right.
Instead, you're more interested, like you were just saying, in when the client becomes more bodily alive somehow. But also, you notice it because I would say the therapist also becomes more bodily alive.
Yes.
You feel it inside of yourself.
Mhm.
What I would sometimes say to supervisees is if something occurs to you to say and you're a little bit unsure about it, you can always rehearse it inside of yourself and ask yourself, like, does this feel okay? Does it feel like the relationship will move with this in some way? Or does it not? Does your body, does your stomach kind of go,
Mhm. Right. Gene had, I forget where this was, but he talked about how any interpretation could be useful at times. The
Mhm.
most outlandish kinds of that what we would think of as outlandish now from
Yeah.
old times, um, and that the therapist can process that in themselves. What if uh, my greatest fear is um, is that I'm going to be castrated by my father because I want my mother. And what does that actually mean? And then when you're processing that, could this person have a fear that assertion um, about the possessiveness of the one that they feel, most connected to the mother will result in a terrible punishment and um, you know being being made helpless. And when you process it, then you can say one little thing from that interpretation and see where it goes. So I can say, you know, is there a fear that there's going to be retaliation if you speak up for yourself or something like that? Then you can sort of see, is that in the direction? Um, and it can be little things rather than a whole big
Mhm.
story.
Mhm.
But I do want to tell you the story. I told you another time, and we took it out of my learning about interpretation when it works. I've always hated from my focusing point of view, uh, and told my psychoanalytic students, the evils of just quoting theory and teaching your client the theory, right, and interpreting from the theory. And so I found myself with someone who would week after week be just eaten alive with a feeling of needing to get back, to needing to justify, needing to get back at this person, not being able to let it go, uh, feeling no matter what we said about it, uh, it didn't shift. And I thought of Kohut's concept, which I actually love this concept of narcissistic rage. And in Kohut's terms, that's very different than anger. Narcissistic rage is when one feels a kind of threat and wound to one's sense of self. And that in order to get back the sense of self, this feeling of fragmentation, that you have to have the revenge and get back at the person in order to undo this
Mhm.
wound. And
Mhm.
Kohut used the Nazis as an example of, 6 million Jews didn't do it for Hitler, right? That the impulse is that the revenge is going to be make things right. and it doesn't work. So there's more and more. Anyway, so I said to this client in a pause, I said, it's almost like you feel so wounded that all that's there for you is this endless hatred and lust for revenge. Those are Kohut's words. She said, yes, that's what I've been trying to say.
So she confirmed the theory in that moment.
Well, I wouldn't say she confirmed the theory. I would say that theory, which was born of Kohut's lived experience of life, that he knew about from the inside, that he wrote about. I mean, I don't know if this has to do with it, but he was also Jewish, escaped from the Nazis, and had to completely redo his sense of self in America. That he knew that, and that way that he expressed it was a reflection, was exactly what resonated for that person.
Mm-hmm. How would you, if you hadn't known the theory, I wonder what you would have said?
Well, this is where, not that I want to reintroduce our argument, I'm not, but this is where I think that theory can be really helpful, because I was feeling stuck. Powerful caughtness of the client in this feeling, like a trap that she couldn't get out of, and all of the other things, as Jean says, do anything and then go back to listening, hadn't touched that. And so then when I thought about Kohut's theory of narcissistic rage, it just felt right to me. And there was already, before I said it, in me, a sense of relaxation and release. Like, oh, that's what's happening here, or that's a way of seeing what's happening here. And it got us out. Theory can get you out of traps, because if the story is a universal enough story, and I see theory as these stories of human experience, then it can touch the place that you can't quite, you're not allowed to really put your finger on or really articulate.
I would say, just to continue with our argument about theory, I would say, when you're describing that client's dilemma, stuckness, as you call it, when I'm listening to you, I feel like I can put myself in her place to some extent. And I feel like I could do, like I often do with clients, really kind of feel into that. And take, without judgment, really feel into that experience and sort of carry it forward inside of me. It's like, what's trying to happen here? What can't I stand in this situation? And then come out with some metaphors that try to point to that. Theory can do that. Ordinary language and just trying to describe the experience can do that. But I would also say literature can do that. Films can do that.
Yes.
And in fact, I've grown to come to think that probably a lot of the best, most useful kind of metaphors for human experience come from the arts rather than psychology.
Yes.
Because they are so much more experience near often.
Right. Well, I think that our argument isn't alive anymore because I totally agree with you. um, you know Steve Moskowitz. He's a wonderful therapist who is helping with the YouTube channel. He tends to quote lyrics to songs, and he uses that in the same way that I would use theory. And his clients really respond to that.
But just, I mean, I think you're talking about the use of theory, which is very sensitive to the client's experience.
Yes, yes.
There's a lot of use of theory that isn't.
Yes.
And that's the danger. And I know that you're certainly not standing up for that.
Right.
But that is the sort of thing that it's not so uncommon, I would say, if you're teaching therapists to work in this more experience, moment by moment kind of experiential way, that often can get in the way, where the therapist is wanting to jump to an understanding that isn't there for the client. It may even be a helpful understanding, but it just isn't there for the client in that moment. And how to encourage the therapist to really stay in the moment with the client and to not, like I was saying before, leap ahead or jump too far away from where the action is right then.
Yes. Yeah. I agree. I had a psychoanalytic supervisee in my group, and we did role play or interactions in the group, and he was constantly, making conceptual statements and or helpful statements, like, have you tried this, or can you think of it that way, or something like that. And I invited him to just reflect and not to do anything else for 10 minutes. And it was so hard for him to do it. And he persisted, or the group helped, and he did it. And he said, oh my God, that is a completely different way of working. I feel like a different person, he said, when I'm doing that. That's not the way I think of therapy at all. But he was excited about it.
One of the things that I teach often is, if you do have a suggestion or a good idea that you want to offer the client, and you have some sense that it's going to fit, I always suggest, fine, but reflect first. So you offer the reflection so that the client's body kind of can relax into having been heard. And then you can offer, maybe it's kind of like, or it reminds me of a kind of a tail to the reflection, that then you can see, does that help the client move a little bit further, or does that take them in a different direction?
Right. And it's that seeing what it does that is so important.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back. Sometimes there's like a dangling thread, like in crochet. When you were saying that interpretations can really get in the way, and when you're not paying attention to what it does. And I just wanted to add in there that in the relational psychoanalytic world now, that would be spoken about as empathy, and that the empathy is the curative. Kohut said, what's curative is to feel deeply understood. And so when you're not deeply understanding, and I always love that little definition, to feel deeply understood, because the deeply is where the focusing comes in. It's not just to feel understood, like, oh yes, that's true. But to feel deeply understood is a different kind of experience.
Mhm.
It includes that underneath, that level. And I think that's what we're really talking about, is that
Yeah.
that Jenlen's work is so helpful in articulating that level of experience that we have to go to, that is different than the ordinary, everyday, linear, logical level. And that when we get to that level, that's when we feel deeply understood.
I think that is such an important point. It is, the understanding needs to go into the area that has never been even put into words before
Yes, yes.
and carried forward at that level. It's not at the level of words, even if we're using words to point to it.
Right.
It's almost like there's something that's living in the darkness down there that needs to see a little flashlight pointed in its direction, at least, in order to feel encouraged enough to make a move.
Right.
And it is, and that's why I think sometimes it's very important that what we say back to the person isn't a mere reflection, unless saying the reflection back with felt meaning can touch that deeper place.
Mhm.
Sometimes it does.
Mhm. Right. Yes. Yes, sometimes it does. And then it's that touching of that place that is what moves something forward.
Yeah, and it, for me at least, I would say it touches both of us. If I'm working as a therapist at that level with a client, I can feel my body opening up to the vast, reaches of the unknown. And I know then that whatever I'm going to say next, it's something I've never said before, or never said with feeling, or something fresh and new is moving in me at the same time.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. That it's emerging in us, and we're not separate
Mhm.
beings.
Exactly. It's using us in order to emerge.
Right. That's right. It's using us to emerge. I like that. Yeah. And we can become more and more sensitive to the emergence as we develop as therapists. And that's sort of like a musician learning to be really sensitive to the tones and the
Mhm.
spaces, or an artist to colors and shapes. It's something we sort of cultivate.
I'd like to say just one last thing from my side is I think that points to how important it is that if you're working as a focusing oriented therapist, that you have a focusing practice. That it's something that you have integrated into your own life, or at least that you do with another person, so that you can over and over again have that experience of opening to that level, so that when you can sense it in the client, you kind of know what that's like somehow.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes, yeah. It's very hard to teach uh, psychotherapy to people who haven't had that experience. I'm sure they've had that experience, but they haven't noticed it.
Yeah.
And it's that noticing when the level shifts, or there's a little bit of the level in there. It's not all or nothing. Or there's a little bit of aliveness, or a little bit of curiosity, or a little bit of connectedness, or
Yeah.
something, not a whole full-fledged felt sense as Jean would define felt sense, but a something that's there, and we're attuned to it, and we're welcoming it, and sort of courting it. I like Donald Stern's phrase, courting surprise, and that's sort of in there. Courting it. What's oh, I saw something, a flicker there.
And for me at least, there's usually a subtle feeling of excitement,
Yeah.
just a very subtle excitement.
Mhm.
Yeah. That we're on to something that we don't know where it's going somehow.
It's true. And it also can be a feeling of anxiety or insecurity, because it's like, oh, there's something here, big here. And if I'm insecure with this person,
Mhm,
like, oh,
mhm,
I'm not in control, or where is this going to go? Or,
mhm,
you know, so you're always working with your own, um, going right to the edge of your comfort level, where you're not
mhm.
over the edge, but you're being, you know, really scared, but you're not staying right in your comfort zone where everything is pretty much predictable.
Yeah.